on the call. So if people want to do a deep dive, they can figure it out. Uh, Very shortly, I'm your classic family business guy. Got conscripted in the family business at the age of 5 or 6 when my parents basically put me in a suit and said, go to office. Been an entrepreneur since then, started a bunch of companies, did a bunch of foundations as well. Today, I look after a portfolio of companies which work in the education space, in the pharmaceutical, construction, real estate, publishing, a bunch of very random stuff, mostly in the MSME, a couple of large ones as well. Education, my undergrad was at Stanford, then ended up going to Harvard Business School for my MBA. And I'm a super passionate learner. So every 3 months, I try to take some sort of course online. And that's held me well. But just for the call, everybody, I'm so delighted. Thank you so much, YI and Global Shapers for having me. And I'd like to start off with a very standard disclaimers. I am not a health or medical professional, right? Um, a lot of what I'll be saying is a lot of clinical trial data and things that have come up from our pharmaceutical unit, which is actively right now working on COVID-19, both in scaling up existing cures and seeing what we can do. But I'm not a doctor. I'm not a healthcare professional. And the second thing, my views throughout this call are principally my own. I took over as a chairman of CIA Delhi State. So this is not me as a chair of Delhi State talking, nor am I talking on behalf of my companies. So, which is why you see a blank backdrop here and not one of the companies there. So these are my personal views. And I think because of that, I'm very happy to answer all sorts of questions. And by the way, everybody, I really want to focus on questions. Natalia and I went back and forth, and I was earlier thinking, I'm going to do a 10-minute slide thing and all of that. And, we said, what, that's just not going to work. Let's just stick to really trying to go deep dive into a couple of great areas. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Aditya. This is great. So before we proceed, I think a few people still have their microphone on. Can we please request everyone to mute their microphone?
Varun, can you, we have Varun from YI Delhi Chair who's hosting. Varun, can you try and mute them out? Excellent.
Great.
Unmute us. Thank you.
Yes. So Aditya, as you know, we saw that there's a lot of enthusiasm for this webinar because a lot of people were sort of coming in actually at 5:40 and 5:45, and I've had an outpouring of questions in my private box since then. So this is really great. But I think before we get into any of the audience questions, the first question that I'd like to ask is really, we're hearing this term black swan a lot these days.
Absolutely, yes.
So I mean, definitely a lot of people are arguing, should we call COVID-19 a black swan? Should it not be called a black swan? What exactly is this term? Please help us understand. And also, like the clause of force majeure, I think we discussed this the other day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is this something we're going to see more and more in the next coming weeks?
Sure. So I think I cannot find a better definition, by example, of a black swan event than COVID-19, right? And I won't get into the history and etymology of the word because we'll be here all night figuring out the history. But in a sense, right, the simple definition of a black swan is an event that nobody could have predicted, right? There was just impossible to predict. It comes out of nowhere, and no one's really prepared for it, right? Now, some would argue that, look, we all knew we had SARS, we had MERS, we had a lot of viruses. The US spent $800 million on bioterrorism. If it wasn't going to come naturally through zoonosis, it was going to come through some lab somewhere. But here now, the way it looks, absolutely black swan. And one of my favorite ways to look at black swans is, and I forgot the gentleman who did this, but they put out a black swan predictions, and they said, here are our top black swan predictions for the next 3 years. It was 1 blank, 2 blank, 3 blank, and basically it said that's the definition. If we could predict it, it would not be a black swan. And so I think COVID-19 snuck up on everybody. Even if you take the long tail that, hey, we knew about this in December or in Jan or Feb, um, you know, sitting in November, even in December, even in Jan, I think no one could have predicted the world would lock down. And so it pretty much fits the cookie cutter of what would you call black swan. Now, moving on to force majeure, and I think force majeure is a very, very important concept. Now, it's basically Latin for act of God, right? And it's a standard in most contracts. Most contracts that everybody has signed here will have a force majeure clause, which says that a payment and performance on this contract is dependent on everything else, but in case of an act of God. Now, historically, particularly in India, we haven't had a very strong force majeure a precedent in our courts. There have been examples. Other countries like the US, UK, and all have force majeure built in to their laws and their systems much more cleanly. And so I think there's a lot of chatter among lawyers that when would it apply? Is this a force majeure? B, traditionally, and if you read the way the government has interpreted it in their procurement manuals, they've given examples. They've given earthquakes, they've given floods, they've given factory closure due to war or this and that. In most of the Indian force majeure clauses or definition, pandemic has not really made an appearance. Now, I know a couple of insurance companies have already put it out there that yes, you have force majeure insurance, you have closure insurance, but it did not specifically cover pandemic, so we're now going to pay business continuity. However, I think 2-3 good notices have come from the government. One on their own internal procurements, the others from the railways, third for performance or exports, where they are saying that, look, we are treating this as a force majeure. And the last 3 days, we have seen everybody from Indian Oil Corporation to one or two of the large automotive companies invoke those clauses and say all supply contracts are off, all purchases are off, and we need to hit the drawing board. Now, the reason why this is such an important part for everybody here to understand, if you have existing supply contracts, if you have contracts for anything, they will probably have a force majeure clause. Now, how it is put down matters, and different lawyers could interpret it in different ways, but it also means that you could wake up tomorrow morning and suddenly the contract which you thought was ironclad, now thanks to this, no longer applies, right? Mm-hmm. Payments you're expecting are not going to come. Purchase orders, sales supplies suddenly are invalidated. And so one of the big things which I recommend everybody to do is, at least for the 80-90% of your revenues or your payments, look at those contracts, see what sort of clause do you have and what rights do you have. Maybe you don't need to use it, but you should know what that text is, because I don't think many people, I've had very few arguments with lawyers on the force majeure clause contracts. I've had with everything else. They're like, oh, we're going to spend an hour on force majeure. Now that's going to happen. Now the consequences, I think at least a year and a half of litigation is going to happen in courts, as companies are going to go to court and say, no, you could not have canceled this contract. You could not have said no to this supply. And I think that's going to play out. I do also want to say that there are some notices from the government which are trying to define the force majeure as a period. And so, for example, in some of the procurement clauses, there is that you have to notify it immediately, which is important. So you can't claim force majeure afterwards. You have to write a letter to your buyer, supplier, customer, etc., and say, look, please, this is under force majeure. We'll still try to supply, we'll still try to buy, but I'm giving you formal notice that this is coming under force majeure. Yeah, we're not saying anything has changed, but at least on the ground. And usually there's a 90-day period which covers force majeure that at least some of these notices are trying to put in, that if you have 90 days to pause, but then post 90 days, your obligations might come back. And so this isn't a get out of jail free card. This isn't a card where you can say, force majeure, everything is out the window. But for companies who need it, I think it is useful, but I think it's also going to have devastating impacts, because I think a lot of SMEs and MSMEs were counting on supply contracts coming in, larger MNCs and all holding, given the government holding that, yes, we will pay, yes, we will buy. And once they start invoking those clauses, I think that's going to create a bit of trouble.
Yes, because it will sort of escalate down the entire supply chain if everybody.
Absolutely, right? You have the end user automotive guy saying force majeure, right? All their suppliers, their component system, that goes to subcomponents, that goes to steel, that goes to imports, right? Similarly, oil, right? So then that floods down to downstream suppliers as well. It interferes with how people are looking at their manufacturing capability. People will end up with huge amount of inventory for raw materials because they bought it for a contract, which is, guess what, has now been paused, at least if not canceled, for the next 90 days. So it's one of the things that I don't think is being discussed in the media or the business media enough. And I think everyone should pay attention, have a look, because you're going to see a lot of them happening in the next 15 days.
And in an event like this, how do businesses go about doing their inventory recalibration? Because it's very difficult to be able to predict what's going to happen even in the next 15 days, if, not 3 months.
So one of the interesting parts when you have a crisis like this is the information asymmetry. And we saw this in 2008. We saw this a bit of it in 9/11. We saw it during the dot-com crisis. You don't know how much trouble a person is. They're not taking out reports. They're not pushing stuff out. Who's going to go under? You might see a very solid facade of a company, but internally they've had a credit line due, or loans to be paid, or they've mismanaged some cash because they were going on an investment spree. Again, black swan, right? It happened like that. It's not like a slow recession thing, right? It's a quick thing there. So it caught a lot of people off guard. And I think the best time here is to communicate. Call. I know people who are talking to their suppliers, who are talking to their vendors daily. They are talking to the people who are buying from them daily, asking them what's going on, what can we do, what's happening, keeping those connections and open, and those lines of communication open. The more you know what's happening downstream and upstream in your industry, the better you understand what's going to happen. I know for a fact, and that's for a couple of our chemical companies, we're actually loading up on inventory, right? Because suddenly it's so cheap, people are dumping goods. And we're like, hey, yeah, we'll buy it because it's like 30% off, 40% off. And we know the market will recover in 1 year. And for us, that's money in our pocket. That's sort of the best investment we can make at times. So it's not all doom and gloom and say, oh, dump everything and run out of cash. But in general, I would advise keep inventory levels low. The industry I'm talking about is very unique because it has a long inventory hold period and low expiries. But right now, I would, in uncertainties, don't load up on inventory, load up on cash. That's the biggest thing you can do right now.
Right. Also, it's interesting that, in this event, there are some sectors which are coming out as very clearly hit by the demand, sort of downturn. But then there are also other sunrise sectors, which are starting to emerge, say, for example, digital education. So, in your view, which sectors are you really seeing in the Indian economy in particular as the ones which you think will be hit by the demand drop in the short term, of course, but also in the medium term? And then which are the sunrise ones?
So I'd like to put this in a couple of different ways. First, everybody's hit. Okay, this is 2020, right? There is no industry which is not de-linked from each other, right? There's a lot of opportunists who said, guess what, perfect time for pharma, buy pharma stocks, so people know crazy in medication. That's not happening, right? Or, as you said, digital education. We were very lucky. We had, 5 years of cloud computing investment. And so we run about 13 schools, 16 colleges. Within 2 days, they were back online fully doing their full timetable. And I think that Ken has a brilliant article on it about us as well. And we were able to do that, but we are worried. Because if parents, if people aren't employed, if they are not making money, doesn't matter what great disruptive product you have during COVID-19 or afterwards, they're not going to be able to pay you, right? Because it's going to have such a systemic job loss. Now, to your first question on which are the sectors that were hit, I think it's a domino effect, right? You started with travel, clearly, hotels, travels, borders locked down, airlines, all of those massively hit, right? Then the work from home started, and just the Indian economy, like total lockdown, goods were not moving, and so people thought that, hey, FMCG would do very well because we're running around and grabbing stuff, or food prices will go up. But guess what? Restaurants are closed. Right? So they're not buying this massive bulk of FMCG and goods and, Coca-Cola bottles and all of this stuff which they were doing. So people's consumption overall has gone down. Even if they're going to hoard, how much are they going to hoard compared to the massive economy that was there in retail, in restaurants and all of this? So I don't really think that there is I think there's a lot of innovation that is happening here,
Hmm.
like the digital education. I'm seeing a lot of brilliant people look at how do we operate in a post COVID-19 world, because I think one thing, at least in the medium term, if this lockdown continues, and we can talk about that a bit later, but I don't see things, even this crisis, to be solved for at least 3 to 6 months. It's going
Hmm.
to change consumer behavior.
Hmm.
And that, I think, is a huge opportunity for new companies, for people to come out and say, okay, now consumer behavior has changed. There is disruption, there's volatility. So now I can enter this market with something completely new, which nobody have used earlier. But
Hmm.
also traditional businesses will suddenly see, maybe people don't want to go to restaurants as much anymore, right?
Hmm.
Maybe people, there'll be a subsection of society which is still a little bit leery of going to large crowded theaters, or huge movies, and have festivals and gatherings and all of that. And I think that will take an impact. So at least in the short term, I think everybody's effective. I think it's, I think this is the problem with black swans. It catches everybody off guard. And when you have a complete destruction, people are calling this a recession. It is not a recession. It's a contraction, right?
Yeah.
A recession happens over time. The economy starts to slow, and then it starts to degrow. A
Hmm.
contraction is whoosh, large part of the economy just disappears overnight,
Hmm.
right? And whether it's 5% or 10% or 15%, we won't know until the chips fall. But that impacts everything else. And so my advice for people who are looking at short term, long term, this is a great opportunity to see what goods and services will become in vogue post the COVID-19 era. But
Hmm.
I can't think of any broad-based sector right now which is really thriving, or doing well financially
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
of this. I think there are a lot of people in, for example, digital education, hand sanitizers, for example,
Hmm.
PPE gear, all the COVID stuff around healthcare, etc., who are going to see a bump. Certainly not now. I think that's going to come in the medium term.
Hmm.
Once supplies start, once people sorts out, then they're going to say, okay, you know what? Now we need to rejig our supply chains. We have to figure out how to be more independent as countries. I think then those opportunities are going to start to come, and that's the medium term goal. But there isn't a sector today who can say we are doing great
Hmm.
under COVID-19, because this is a huge opportunity for us. Even the pharma sector can't claim that.
That is unfortunate. So I'm going to take one or two questions from the from the audience now. So one of the questions is really about contracts with migrant labor. Obviously the person happens to be somebody who's running their own firm, and what they're experiencing, and I'm sure a lot of the audience is experiencing the same, is that the migrant labor has left, and they feel that even when the lockdown is over, they may not have a ready workforce.
No,
So,
I mean that's a great question, and I think that is that is something that I'm very, very concerned about. I don't think enough thought has gone into it. So one thing is sure, that most legal experts have come out, and I'm just going to go on their basis, rather than trying to become a lawyer and quote you the law myself, are saying that, look, if you have a contract, uh, pretty much to the 14th of April, you have to honor it. Now,
hmm,
there are ways in which you can mitigate that, in ways in which you can improve your cash flow on that. And, CI Delhi is having a seminar on the 6th, which I will send out the link to on the chat, which is only going to cover this. How do you manage people, blue collar, white collar firings, salary payments delayed? What are your options? What's legal and what's right to do? But I think that's one part. So I think until 14th April, if you have a contract with them, you have to pay. Now, a big question is that we are now looking at, what happens post COVID-19 lockout once we start going up, right? Uh, and I think it's going to be a struggle. And again, I think here is when I know companies who have maybe 50, 100, 200 people. There's two parts of it, right? One, for specialized industries, there is a tacit knowledge. You can't just take an unskilled person off the street and say, hey, come into the factory and start producing at volume, at productivity, at quality, right? So for those who have skilled migrant labor, you want to keep track of them. You want to have their phone numbers. You want to have you want to have your supervisors and managers in touch with them. You want to be able to call them and say, hey, we are concerned about you. So they remember, hey, this was a good employer. They actually they actually took care of us. They were actually concerned for us. Even if they couldn't do anything, they were there. Because, post COVID, that's when you need to call them and say, hey, come back. Things are great. We can offer you this. And you might have to do it. Right? So getting in touch with them now, showing that you care, building that loyalty today is what will help you get them back tomorrow. The second part is also really looking at what you can do in terms of understanding how much skill do you require. And a lot of companies haven't really done a skill analysis down to the last people, particularly on the blue collar side. Is that how fast can you hire somebody and train them up in 5 days or 10 days to use a machine or to do something which is very specific. And now is a great time to have and think through those training programs now. And so that when your factory or when your industry opens, either you already have access to your existing pool of labor, which was there earlier, and some of them are willing to come back, or you have a training program ready, because people will be out of a job, right? A lot of industries have gone under. So there is not going to be a shortage of labor. What is going to be a shortage of is labor at the right price and labor with the right skills. I think that is where you need to bring in your training program from day one, that how can I take these people and quickly train them up to do it? And the last part is look at industries which are tangential to yours. So a lot of skills which are transportable. If somebody's been laid off from the automotive component sector, right, then they're very used to doing and using certain types of machines, right? That same skill, that same understanding about the technical way to run them also applies to a lot of other industries in the plastics or in the textiles, all of that. So you also try to understand from your peers what are the side industries that are there. And so worst case scenario, once you do have to hire these guys, which industries to target. If this guy has worked here, it's probably going to be an easier training in your factory rather than if we're taking someone from a different industry or, from construction or somewhere else. But I would really prefer the first, is if you can keep in touch with your guys and really take care of them, they will come back. And it might be 15 days, might be 30 days, might be 60 days, but they will come back.
I mean, one of the examples that I was sort of researching recently was about Denmark, where they've literally said that they've kept their economy in a deep freezer. And the government has actually given 80% wage subsidy to the MSME sector, and a smaller proportion, I think around 20 or 30% for the larger industries, so that they can actually retain the exact same employers. And employees. I mean, that relationship and that training, which goes into the employee, then doesn't get lost. So that sort of brings me to the discussion of, what kind of policy measures, should we be looking for large business and for MSME? I'm sure they will have to be quite separate. So, how would you sort of, advise that the government should, go about that?
No, so first, I think there are a lot of governments who are doing a lot of things around the world, right? The 80% rule was actually first kicked off by the UK, where they came on their day one, they said, look, we are going to pay 80% of all wages, all companies up to £2,500 per month for everybody. No conditions attached. The $2 trillion bailout, or QE, whatever you want to call it, in the US is saying that any small and medium business can take 2.5 months worth of payroll loan out, no collateral, no personal guarantees, nothing required. So at least they have 2.5 months, and as long as they don't fire anybody, I think they can bring down their wages, but you can't fire them. And pretty much hint, we'll never ask for that loan back. So it's almost like a clean bailout of most of these countries. Now, ideally, what I'd wish the government had done was when they announced the lockdown, was immediately take out all the economic measures then, right? Immediately say, guys, this is going to be hard. We get it. Here's all the amazing things that we're going to do. Day one, don't worry, right? I would have also loved if they were doing daily press conferences like every other country is doing. US is doing, Canada is doing, UK is doing, most European countries are doing, is where they're having a daily press briefing, but they either have the president or prime minister or senior cabinet officials giving the country an update saying this is what you're doing and reassuring everybody. That's it. I think the Indian government has come out with quite a few things. I think the RBI has taken a big lead in doing this. But I'm going to cover some of my first about the Indian economy and how it works, and then I'll try to sort of hit in on why these policy proposals work. So first, I don't like to look at the Indian economy the way people look at the US, European economy. And I get very frustrated. I know, Mitali, you're an economist. My elder brother is an economist. My younger sister is an economist. And I took some econ courses. But, there is a tradition of trying to apply the same economic theory to every country. What happens in India particularly is India is unique. Our economy isn't deep in the formal sector, right? And so you have the US, when the Fed cuts 1 percentage point or 2 percentage point, right? That ripples across the economy super fast, right? That hits mortgages are brought down, lending starts, banks are there. Do you know how many banks are there in the US? It's 4,700 banks, right? 4,700 banks, and you and I can decide to start a bank any day we want, right? In India, there's a limited number of private banks and a limited number of PSU. We're a horribly underbanked nation, right? And so what happens when you say, hey, let's give money to the banks, by the time it reaches SMEs, MSMEs, it's too late. It takes a long time.
Yes.
We have a few banks who are taking very aggressive actions. They made announcements already. There are a few banks who are actually doing it on the ground. But largely, they're caught. Their guys are at home and they can barely cash checks. Forget about processing loan application or credit lines or anything like this. So I get very worried when the solution is, hey, let's give a bunch of money to banks and the banks will take care of the economy. That never happens in India, right? So I think that's the first part, is understanding that you can't take stuff that other countries have done and put it into India. The government has taken a lot of suggestions, including some from CI, that at least cover the payroll taxes, PF, ESI, this, that, etc. But they've made it very limited for now. 100 people companies where 90% people are paid below 15,000 rupees. Now, those are good steps. But what we really need right now is absolutely bold reforms. Now, I am told that is what is being thought of. I have supreme confidence in our finance minister and prime minister to come out with bold reforms in the next 3-4 days. I think it's very clear that they need. But some of the stuff which I'd love to see: one, just the way they said, let's get money into poor people's hand today. I think that was brilliant. I think immediate stuff. Please don't starve. Stay at home. Your food is covered. A minimum amount of rent is covered, minimum amount of expenses covered. 80 crore people, brilliantly done. I think a lot of states also did that. I think Kerala did a great job. Uttar Pradesh did a great job on getting money to people's hand. Very similar. We need to send money back to businesses. And the best way to do that is through the taxation thing. You know how much they made last year. You know what GST they are paying, right? So you don't go to a bank and say, figure out the credit rating or whatever. You said, hey guys, whatever tax you paid, direct or indirect, last year, we'll give you 3 months of it as refund, right? And so people who are the honest tax-paying companies, people who've paid their GST, people who've paid their normal tax, they are the ones who get the money in the bank, and that's what helps them out. And one of the big things, why did the UK do this? Because, and I take the example of France. France said no electricity payments, no tax payments, nothing. And they asked them, why did you do it? And they said, look, if we collect the tax today, we're not going to get any tax for 3 years from these guys, right? Because they're not going to survive. They're going to go under. So we're going to preserve this ecosystem by giving them the freedom, get them out. And so we are investing in the companies in our country. And I think that is a great way the government can do it. The second big thing is they need to now get rid of all bureaucracy. I think, remarkable job in ease of doing business numbers. There is, I think, the most brilliant part about COVID-19 is, and this is credit to Ashutosh Gupta of LinkedIn on our webinar yesterday. We're having this discussion. We're like, who is driving the digital transformation in your company? Is it the CEO? Is it the CTO? Or is it COVID-19, right? And, we just did a massive experiment, right? Can you conduct all business online? Most people said, well, yes, we can. Can you do online banking? Can you do checks? Can you do online paperwork submissions? All of this can be done online. And I think the government should come out with a policy saying that, look, you know what? We have this very aggressive agenda for ease of doing business. We are going to implement it today. Let us eliminate 90% of the laws and regulations. A lot of countries are trying this, and they're saying, look, we were planning to do it anyway. This is a great time. Let's not let this crisis go to waste and say, guys, all these regulations, guess what? We didn't need them. They're not helping anybody. Let's throw them out the window so that businesses can get back on their feet today. That itself would save so much time and energy. I'll give you a small example. Notarization, an apostle, right? There's a lot of documents, including the GEMS marketplace, which needs notarized paperwork.
Yes.
Where are you going to find a physical notary today? Right? You know, land contracts, registrations, you know, simple stuff that you communicate with the government, permissions, permits. Why do we need an inspection rod still? Right? Yes. And so all of this stuff that anyway the government was trying to get tossed out, that needs to get tossed out today. Because if they can, it's a great excuse to say, we're going to do ease of business. We're going to jump from whatever ranks, 60, 80 plus. We're going to zoom into top 10. And I think that's something that they can do today that would really help businesses. Because, you know, it's not practical to even do some of those things anymore. No one's inspecting stuff. No one's waiting for someone to sign off on things. They're not physically available. The third big thing is government procurement. And this thing, you know, I was very happy to see the government has come out with a circular that has given exceptional up to 200 crores per government department to do purchases for COVID-19. But what I would love to have seen is a central COVID procurement website with the government saying, this is what we need. You know, eBay auction style, please bid. You know, supply. You know, right now I'm seeing mass producers in Jaipur. I'm seeing pharma guys in Kolkata and in Himachal Pradesh, and they're saying, look, we're sitting on all this stuff that could be really used by people. No one's buying, right? Because no one has cash flows, no one has credit lines. They're really worried that they'll put up all this COVID-19 inventory, and oh wait, COVID-19 will disappear in 30 days, which it's not, but you know, they're worried. Then what will I do, right? And so they're waiting from a signal from the government that said, look, guys, you know, just as we did for the farmers, any wheat you produce up to this much price, we will buy all of it. Right? Same thing for COVID-19 supplies, that if by this date you can deliver, you know, this pharmaceutical product, this protective gear, this ventilator or thing, as long as it meets these specifications, you give it to us within 60 days, we will pay you this price. And that same order goes out to all the procurement thing. They can even use the existing food infrastructure procurement and say, guys, you know how to do mass buying of food, let's do mass buying of COVID-19. It'll put a shot in the arm for everybody. I think it'll also really define that this lockdown period was useful. We spent it getting our act together. These are just a couple of things. I mean, on the government policy, we could have an entire 2-3 hour session, you know, sector by sector, you know, what they really need to intervene. But broadly, you know, get money into businesses' hands and do it efficiently, not through the slow banking system. You know, now is a great time to decimate regulation so that companies can recover fast, pivot, start to do everything and not wait for permits or licenses or inspections or get worried about, oh, I'm going to do all of this. And guess what? You know, I'll spend my CSR funds on COVID and then a tax notice will come in 6 months. You know, let's throw that out all the window. This is the time to throw it out all the window. And third, focus on immediate mass procurement to get the country ready, because we can't be under lockdown forever.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, the question, I mean, the point you made about regulation, it sort of made me think about the actual implementation of the lockdown. Today, we're seeing a situation where a number of, especially in the farming sector, but I'm sure this is the case in all sectors, the government order which came out by the Ministry of Home Affairs clearly says there's nothing like essential or non-essential commodities anymore. All goods trade within the country should continue. However, we're seeing situations and scenes on our, you know, television screens on almost a daily basis where you're seeing farmers who are dumping milk and throwing it into rivers. You know, they have sort of, you know, good crops and strawberries and grapes and, you know, vegetables which are just rotting. And I mean, of course, it pains all of us, right? Because on one side, we are sort of looking at a scenario where there could be supply shortages, especially in urban centers. And on the other side, you have the situation where suddenly the farmers are seeing that the prices of their produce are just falling unless, they come under the APMC umbrella. APMCs themselves have shut down. APMCs are, of course, the agricultural produce and marketing committees, for the benefit of the audience. So now, on one hand, this is our reality, where even with a government making rules, you're not seeing the, supply of commodities. You're actually seeing supply chains breaking down. And on the other side, we have this recommendation from you, which says, you know what, let's just completely do away with all the regulations. So how do we, from a
Absolutely.
situation
So,
where you,
yeah. No, no. So, okay.
where do we
So
stand?
look, I am a very big fan of good regulation. Okay. I think every market needs good regulation. Otherwise you can't have a market, right? You need laws. Laws need to be followed. And when I meant by get rid of all the regulation thing, I don't mean anarchy, right? What I meant was that there are sensible, good regulations. You can benchmark against a lot of great countries who've tried it, experimented, worked. A small example I'll give you. You have the GST authority, right?
Hmm.
Every place have one GST number, and you can, bill all your invoices to that GST number, where you
Hmm.
bought from, where you sold from, pay the full GST amount there.
Hmm.
And the GSTN organization is an independent organization. It has all the states as its board members. They can decide how the money goes to whom. That's
Hmm.
their problem. You know,
Hmm.
we have something like, we have offices in every state in India, right? So we have something like, 26, 28 major GST numbers into three into, so, it's like 75, 80 GST numbers per company, 4 filings, 240, 250. I mean, you're trying to save your business and, you're sitting and filing these multiple GST and GST, right? So it's small regulations like that, which are not needed, right? They're very efficient ways to do it. And the government has been talking about this GST number as one. It's a crisis. Say, look, under crisis, we're going to get rid of those. But more specifically to what you're talking about, look, the first thing which I'd like to tell everybody is stop believing what you see on the news media. I all my journalist owners and friends are going to get into trouble for me saying this, is that, look, it is not as bad as the way it looks on there. It is bad. In some cases, it is worse, right? But the way it is being portrayed, and I've been seeing some very irresponsible reporting. My favorite was this one channel, and I won't take the name, Hindi channel, which spent half an hour trying to blame the migrant crisis on businesses, right? And these horrible business people, they should all be lynched, and all this stuff, right? And they went and they interviewed all these migrant laborers. Not one of them blamed their business owners. All of them said, we're going home because of family. They're saying our landlords kicked us out. We're having trouble. They said, nobody said, oh, my employer was such a horrible human being. He threw me out and, told me to fend for myself. And the guy literally went around for half an hour trying to find somebody who will blame his business guy, right? This is irresponsible reporting. And I think a lot of what you're seeing on scenes are many different things happening at the same time, but the narrative that is being created is false. First part, look, there is a demand slowdown, right? And particularly on food and pharma, I do want to, remind everybody of how much food we waste, right? You have restaurants who buy inventory. You have hotels. You have this huge amount. You have railways, catering companies. Last time you've gone to into any place which had a buffet, how much food do you think got wasted, right? So there's a huge amount of inventory that is always built up in the system, because that's the way the economy runs, right? And that's what causes the prices to fluctuate, right? Suddenly that's gone, right? You had all these places there, and people are not just buying just the essentials and hoarding them. They're not wasting it because they're worried. They're not wasting food, right? They're sitting at home, they're eating everything, they're doing home cooked meals, they're being very judicious with food. So you suddenly have a massive demand evaporation. So a lot of just seeing those farmers that are happening are not that they don't have anybody to sell them to, or sector. It's just that we've had a collapse of demand all across the segments, and that applies to a lot of industries. Second, I do agree with you. I think because of the black swan nature of this event, and because India, at the end of the day, is a federal republic, we have states, right? Police for the most part, except maybe Delhi being the exception, are under states. And so whatever notices the center gives is subject to interpretation on the ground. Now, I don't think anybody could have predicted the way things turned out, at least in the first couple of days. when you had police people and doing it. But I think at least in terms of really understanding how supply chains work, what they should have been was a central source of truth. And I think now the government has put up a dedicated COVID notice website. But what would have been really nice to see if all the states and center had said, look, we're going to have one website where everything related to COVID is put on that one website, both at the center level and
Yeah.
state-wise. There
Hmm.
is a website which has come out on that. I don't want to share the URL now with you because I still think it's not as updated as it should. But
Hmm.
in the first 10 days, we were literally sending out government notices on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
We had delivery drivers and all going around showing it, sir, notice, this one, and the guy peering at it, and he doesn't know if it's fake or real. When the curfew passes happened in some states, people went to police stations and they said, yeah, we haven't heard about this. And oh, okay, I guess it's a new notice, because
Hmm.
India is not used to working at that speed. We aren't used to having an order given at the top and whoosh, implementation all the way at the bottom. I think that's a very critical learning from here. And I
Hmm.
think as time goes by in the next 5 to 10 days, we'll see that being sorted out. But I think having that central source of truth, having to make sure that everything that is said there is properly brought in, is going to be absolutely essential going forward from here. But please, everybody, go to scholar.google.com. I'm going to write it down in the chat for you, uh, because this is going to not scholar.google.com. If you want to know what's happening in COVID from the medical field or anything, this is the site you need to go to. Please don't go to the normal google.com, because it's
Hmm.
not peer reviewed, it's not science. A lot of what you're seeing on media, on videos, even the media is at home. They're struggling to catch up. So I don't blame them.
Yeah.
So they have to generate a 24-hour channel thing. So please be careful. Think for yourselves. Think through the full ecosystem and context.
Right. So now let's change our attention a little bit and do bring in a little bit of a deep dive focus onto the pharma sector, because I know that you're obviously involved in that sector. Um, the question that a lot of people have been sending in the last few days to me is: have price controls actually led to a situation where there's a disincentive to innovate? Whether it's cures or a vaccine. We're still seeing a lot of the R&D happening at the ICMR or government sort of sector. So I mean, what is the sort of
Oh,
way
wow.
out?
No, I could go on for price controls for a couple of hours, but look, I am going to try to keep it very tight and just talk about how is it affecting COVID.
Mm.
Just for everybody to note, just to explain how the government does price controls, right? So what the government says is that any product that is sold in India, if it's on an essential list, if it's an essential product to India, we are going to take the average price, right? The lowest guy who's selling it, and the highest, and by volumes, you're going to put a tag on it, right?
Mm.
Um, a bad version of the analogy which I use is that, it's like saying, okay, transportation device car, there's a BMW and there's a Maruti Suzuki. So we're going to take the average price of that. And guess what? All BMWs now have to be sold at that average price. You can do the same thing for phones, your iPhone, supersonic, whatever, etc. And your cheap, 7,500 rupee smartphone, which is just barely functional, take the average price of that. And now that's the price you sell, right? So what generally happens is, the moment a product comes under price control, for every product in pharma, normally there are 20, 30 suppliers, which is
Mm.
unique. That's a unique thing to India, and it's fantastic. It's a highly competitive industry. We have thousands of pharma companies. Most countries barely have 40, 50 pharma companies, right? India is one of those great places where you have amazing amount of pharma companies. And when you have this sort of price control mechanism, the next morning, everybody leaves. So you only have 3 to 4 companies who are able to sell it at the very cheapest price, right? So
Mm.
what happens is people stop paying attention to those drugs. They stop, they cut corners. They,
Mm.
the same drug you take in India, like a paracetamol, for example, has more side effects than if you take it somewhere else, because no one's innovated on how to make a paracetamol with less side effects, with a longer dissolve period, with a more, sort of a better pill all to all, right? So
Mm.
that sort of innovation stops. Now in the COVID-19 has been a unique trap. hydrochloroquine, which and is one of the major drugs now, which is sort of being pushed out, that this is the big drug that we really have to push. And hydrochloroquine is under price control, right? And last I saw, it was something like 60, 70 rupees or maybe 80 rupees per strip. Now, there are two parts. There's the formulation, which is what you and I buy, the strip, the little tablets. And then you have the raw material that goes into it, right? It's called the API. Thanks to the worldwide shortage, API cost went up 6 times, 7 times, right? And so now what you have is that people are saying, look, we are manufacturing this at 180 rupees, 270 rupees for a pack of 10 tablets. But I still have to sell it at 80, 90 rupees a tablet. That's not possible, right? And so because of price controls, India has the biggest capacity. We could in 30 to 60 days produce enough of this medicine for every single person in the country. Every single person. Can you imagine 1.3 billion doses? We have the capacity to produce that. But because of these price control problems, we don't have innovative drugs in malaria. There's this thing. And look, governments are trying to intervene. I know certain governments are trying to buy the API directly, whatever it costs, and then getting the formulation made, so at least they have stock. Governments like the US, Europe, and all are saying, we don't care, our people matter first. Open tender, what price can you supply it at? Supply. We'll pay high cost, we'll pay mid cost, we'll pay low cost. And I think that's the right way to do it. But I'll give you another horrible example. Tuberculosis, 1,300 people die every day in India. Right? People forget. TB, largest killer of people in India, right? There is a drug, and to cure tuberculosis, 6 months daily drug, horrible drugs, side effects. It's people lose their hearing. If you have latent TB, and I'm convinced, according to statistics, 40% of our audience has latent TB, right? Just by living in India, right? To eliminate latent TB, you have to take a pill every day for 6 months, right? There is a new pill, and I won't name the company, they got it out. It's 13 doses, 1 pill a week, great side effect profile. They refuse to launch it in India. They said, look, the moment we launch it, you're going to say it's an essential drug. You're going to put it under price control. Guess what? We love India. We will tell the government, here's the drug. You can make it. We will license it to anybody in India. Make it. You want to make million, you don't want to make it. That's up to you. But we are not going to launch it. Now, this drug came on the international market last year. It's still not available in India. 1,300 people dying every day. And so price controls create problem. And the last on that, the worst is for the rural sector. Because pharma companies today don't actually make much money on generic medicine. They don't.
Right.
50 to 60% of all that cost is in the distribution. Getting it from a factory in Himachal to a central distribution, sending it out into the field, getting it to tier 2, tier 3 towns, then from there going to chemist margins 23%, right? 67% cost is in the distribution thing, right? When you have a price control system, distributors said, no, it's not worth stocking this drug because we're just not going to make enough margin on it. And so the worst off are actually the people in the tier 2, tier 3 and rural towns who get deeply impacted, because urban, there's demand, there's a lot of stuff. You'll get straight from the factory, one shot, it spreads, right? And think that. So I hope post COVID-19, there's a lot of talk. I know our Department of Pharmaceuticals has come up again with a strategic API policy. They're going to come out with a strategic drug policy because we really need this. We can't be there. But I think that now once they do this, hopefully this won't happen again. Now, so fingers crossed that at least some lessons get learned, that how price controls take the country that should have been the most prepared for this to one of the least prepared countries.
No, this is, I mean, for me, I've never actually understood this better than, how you've explained it now. So thank you so much for that, 5-minute explanation of price controls. It's really, interesting. Now, one of the interesting questions which has come from the audience is about the impact on the banking sector. of this crisis, to which I would add maybe also impact on insurance companies, which have now got the directive from IRDA, the regulator,
You have
to
to
say
cover it.
that you have to cover COVID costs. So what is your view on that?
So look, so I've been very disturbed by the banking crises in the last 4 or 5 years, and I think the way
Hmm.
Yes Bank entire crisis was handled, it could have been handled better. Quite frankly, there was no need to scare everybody to that extent. I think the government did the correct thing by trying to bail it out. Obviously, we don't want it to go under. It was a systemically important bank, but let me put this into perspective, right? If you had asked me maybe 3 4 months ago, I would have had a very different answer. Post COVID-19, post all this thing, I've completely changed my mind on this. Again, the US has 4,700 banks,
Hmm.
right? You and I could get together and say, let's raise a bunch of money and start our banks. We don't like our bank, it's not doing well. We are scared about it. Let's go start a bank, right? In
Hmm.
India, a bank is nothing but a government monopoly to take cheap money from depositors and give it to a bunch of lenders, right? And it's this monopolistic institutions which are failing us. And to all those bankers out there, I love you guys. But but I think the banking model that India has followed has failed. I think it's been failing for the last 10 15 years, and I think India needs to take a call how they want to do banking reforms, because what's going to happen? You're going to have a massive amount of NPAs. You're going to have a massive amount of defaults all across the board. We are going to see banks which need to be recapitalized. We are going to see somewhat of what happened in 2008 to 2009. Now, I think India is a little bit better prepared than the rest of the world. Our debt levels are not that insane compared to what they were for other economies at that point, but it's still pretty high. And I think coming and companies were all their balance sheets were already stressed,
Hmm.
right? And so I know that's why I'm saying give money directly to companies. Sending them through the banks, it's just going to make them more stressed, which is just going to lead to more NPAs and such. So I think that's going to be something everybody's going to do out. But what I hope is that the government and the RBI says, look, we've gotten banking wrong in India. Either one, we need a lot more banks, which are publicly listed, which have good governance, so consumers and all have options, and we get a lot more investors into new banks rather than continuing to prop up the old banks. And I've posted this publicly. I think the government should completely put a wall between depositing banks and between lending banks. I think I
Hmm.
think every bank should be asked to demerge and say, look, if you're taking public deposits, great. You're allowed to put them in a safe government treasuries. That's great for the government. They'll love that. They can sell huge amount of debt, right? You have to put them in safe custody accounts, which gives you this much interest, and you take a percentage of that and you pass it to the consumer, and you earn money through payment services, through mutual funds, and all of this other stuff as a very traditional depositing bank. And then you have lending banks, which have access to their investor capital and which have controlled access to the central bank, to the RBI capital, and they focus only on lending. Because mixing these two, I think, has created a whole bunch of problems for everybody involved in India, where depositors are worried about, is my money safe? Right
Yeah.
now, the biggest question, and particularly this was right after Yes Bank, is everybody was saying, who's next, right?
Yeah.
Where should I take my money out? You don't want bank runs. There is no need for bank runs, right? Banks are, well supported, well built out. No bank should have a run. It makes no sense for this to happen. And so I think banks are going to be in trouble. I think for the people in the room, certainly please talk to your bankers, talk to the relationships, look at what's happening to them. If you have a lot of money, anything above 20, 30 lakh in a bank account, I would look and see, is this bank going to be stressed for the next 3 to 4 months? I
Hmm.
don't think your money is going anywhere, but I think you might have trouble accessing it. And that's a very real fear.
Hmm.
Does that mean you should pull out all your money from your banks and put it in cash? Absolutely not. That's not the way to go either. But I would be careful for banks. My general advice to all companies here: start calling your banks, start getting credit lines now, because everybody's going to be calling them in 30 days. And you don't want to be the last person out. Call them even if you don't need the money. Have the credit line open today, right? A lot of banks, SBI, Kotak, everybody has launched small business, medium business a credit line. Start having those conversations, start filing the paperwork, because you will need cash at some point. Better to have that credit line, your 50L, 1CR, 5CR, whatever you need on tap today, rather than wait for another 30 days, 60 days and see, wait and watch what happens.
Right. Right. That's very important. And what about the insurance sector?
So look, I think you're going to have a lot of lawsuits. I think the insurance companies are very smart. I think they have clearly already started messaging publicly that, look, a lot of the coverage businesses at least bought don't cover pandemics and don't
Yeah,
cover
exactly.
COVID and all of that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be a battle, and I think I doubt if the IRDA and all are going to step in on that, because they also realize that suddenly if they have to pay out all business stoppage policies or all wage coverage policies, they're going to go bankrupt. So,
Exactly.
I mean, this is like a systemic, last thing what you want is like a systemic event for insurance companies like AIG and all of that. On
Hmm.
the health insurance side, I think they're going to be fine. I think they'll take a hit.
Hmm.
Um, See, the cost of COVID is not that high on an individual basis, right?
Yeah.
The pills are inexpensive. You're talking about a brief hospital visit for some people, a little bit of ventilation, and most of it is going to be covered by Ayushman Bharat, the government. There going to be a couple of complications out of that, but I don't really see a massive systemic hit on them in terms of having to do huge payouts more than they're not. Let me give you the converse, by the way. What is the great benefit of all this social distancing, isolation, and actually washing your hands? Other diseases go down, right? So you have a whole bunch of other diseases which these guys, the same people, would have taken health insurance, which would have gone down. And so, I mean, there will be an impact, but I don't see it today with the numbers that we are seeing and how we are seeing. That is going to be such a massive, like a healthcare systemic impact all across that it's going to bankrupt them completely. I think more on the business stoppage, on wage, on all of that, where their policies haven't been legally worded correctly. I think that's where they're going to really take a hit. If you'll notice, by the way, most of them have stopped selling COVID-19 policies. until 1 week ago, for 500 rupees, you could still buy a COVID-19 policy.
Really?
Really, and a lot of people did, and that's sort of gone.
Hmm. So the questions from the audience, there's one set of questions. They're asking about logistics and chemical sector, and then someone also asked about the steel sector. So essentially, it comes down to the core sectors, right? I mean, what kind of outlook are we seeing for the core sectors? Real estate in particular, it's interesting because on one hand, you might see demand for housing actually go up. If you have to spend more time in your house, well, rather have a better house. So, how does
That's an
that
interesting
work?
perspective. No, no. Okay, so let me give my 2-3 bits based on some of what our CI members and all have come back to us. So I'm going to lean on what I've been told as well, rather than just a sector analysis. Look, first and foremost, as I said at the very start of this is going to be a massive demand, a depressing event. It's going to take us 6 months, 1 year, 1.5, maybe even 3 years to really pull up demand, unless there is a government intervention of extraordinary orders. I think the US got it right. The size of their stimulation, of their stimulus package is insane. It's like 4 or 5 times what they did in 2008. It's more than all they spent on the Iraq wars, Afghanistan wars, Iraq, 18 years combined. They're going to blow through in 1 year, right? And that's the type of leadership, and that's the type of insane stimulus you do to stop this massive demand fall for the next 2 to 3 years. I don't think the Indian government has money to be able to even do that. So
Yeah.
even if you would like them to do it, I don't think they can command that level of cash to push into the economy. I think globally for core sectors, it's going to be a struggle. I think particularly in terms of steel, base chemicals, all of this, I think it's going to be tough times, at least for a couple of years going ahead. I don't see massive construction or massive things happening unless there's a huge government push to start absorbing it. And a great way to look at it is China. Look at their figures, right? and a great way to look at oil.
Hmm.
Yes, there's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories of why oil is at 20, and Saudi Arabia and Iran and all, and I'm not going to go into that, but we have a massive drop off in oil consumption, right? And
Hmm.
you're going to see that in a lot of different sectors.
Hmm.
Chemicals I put separately, and the reason why I put that separately, I think the good part about chemicals is that with low oil, uh, uh, it's a fantastic time because your raw material costs have just dropped. Your solvents, especially if you're downstream of the petrochemical industry, I think
Hmm.
it's an absolute great time because even though demand has dropped, but so has cost. So suddenly you're going to be a lot more competitive out
Hmm.
there. Also, the second thing is, and I really hope the Indian government does it. I think a lot of governments realized is that they need to bring back supply chains from China. I
Yes.
think I think a lot of core stuff, even
Hmm.
when it comes to steel, even when it comes to chemicals and all the stuff is going to be pushed up and say, look, guys, we need to bail out these industries, we need to invest in them, we need to push them up. Because if we don't, and the next time there's a massive crisis and every country is like everybody's on their own now, right?
Hmm.
And borders are locked, any crucial chemical, any crucial pharma export ban, you can't take it out.
Hmm.
You're going to see a lot of that pour in. And you do note, once we're done with COVID, by the way, 6 months, 7 months, there is going to be a rapid re-pull once of inventory back into the system, right? Most of the system keeps about 30 days of cash and about 3 months of inventory as standard. In India, it's actually even longer because of the long distribution time. Some people even keep up to 60 um, days in local depots and almost 6 months upstream.
Hmm.
And I think that is something that is, at least for chemicals and other core industries, I do see a bit of an upswing happening there, but
Hmm.
pretty much betting on oil. And of course, saying that there'll be a one-time inventory push-up to
Hmm.
recapitalize on that. And I'm very confident of what the government's saying on having bulk drug parks and all of that. So, you know,
Yeah.
those things I'm a little bit more confident on at the moment. But it's going to be a tough 2-3 years.
Yes. So last question, absolutely. Again, just responding to the audience questions. Somebody is asking. Okay, maybe I'll take two if you can
No,
extend.
wait, pause. I have to do on housing and real estate because there was such a thing. I
Yes,
almost forgot
I
that
was
question where I laughed. So look, I am super bullish on office space, uh,
okay.
and a lot of people think I'm crazy, and I'll tell you why.
Hmm.
There are a few things that are happening worldwide which were happening before the economic crisis
Hmm.
of which COVID has brought, and I
Hmm.
think COVID is just going to exacerbate them.
Hmm.
First, this is India. I'm not talking now about the worldwide. Okay, so everybody, very specific to India, right? This is not applicable if you're sitting in the US or in Europe, different markets. This game is always a local market game and a micro market game, even in India, right? But a few things are going to happen. First, we just conducted the world's largest experiment in outsourcing,
Hmm.
right? What we said was we don't need people in office, go home. Now, whether a person is sitting in India or they're sitting 1 mile from you in Philadelphia down street, it's the same experience, right? We just forced companies around the world to say, guess what? We all need to work over Zoom and do digitally and do team
Yeah.
projects and all of this, right? And so suddenly, a huge number of large outsource providers and captive guys going out and saying, guess what, guys, we can do this. We can move and cut costs by moving a whole bunch of stuff from the US, from Europe. And that's what people are going to focus on, is custom costs now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And even 50% of wage labors, right? So I see a huge surge of outsourcing, a huge surge of captives more than outsourcing, to be quite honest,
Hmm.
heading towards India, which is going to consume a massive amount of office space because you have so many people who are now comfortable with it,
Right.
right? You know,
Right.
if you met a CIO or you met somebody, 4 months ago from a medium-sized US company, 2,000 employees, and said, hey, why don't you move half of these people to India? He's going to say, I can't do this. That's ridiculous. They
Hmm.
just did it. They just
Yeah.
moved them all of the thing, right? So I think
Hmm.
that's a big thing there. Second, I do think there are going to be long-term regulations on how dense office space can be. If you're
Yes.
looking at Singapore, they're already saying, at least for some periods of time, you're going to have to practice a bit of social distancing. And
Hmm.
that's just going to drive up the amount of per square footage large companies need.
Hmm.
For office space, you had a 10,000 square foot office. Guess what? New regulations, you now 20,000, because each person has to be given a larger square space. So, there's a bit of social distancing norms that are happening, and this might continue at least for a year, 2 year, 3 years, right?
Hmm.
And so I think these two big trends are going to push it.
Hmm.
But that's the Indian context. I
Hmm.
think housing, I don't think people are going to be very happy working from home. I think a lot of people, I think that's now.
Hmm.
But I do see people, particularly who are going to join the gig economy and freelancers wanting co-working spaces as well.
Yes.
I think they've learned. I think the key learning for a lot of people during this time is they can't work from home. They have family, they have people doing the thing, and so I think now that we've experienced that, I think a lot of them. So, just 3, 4 very macro stuff happening. And we had already seen salaries in the US go crazy, particularly for tech and finance. And that's going to come down, right? And that's going to pause a little bit of it. But
Yeah.
but I do think that is going to hit India as well. So, tier A plus office space in India is going to do very, very well.
Hmm.
Housing, I think affordable is going to do again very well. I think the government is going to double down on that. I think they're going to come out with a lot of stuff to support the industry. They already did before.
Hmm.
And I think it's for them politically also. It's going to be, I think, watching the migrant crisis unfold before us. I can't think of any more push for having more urban affordable housing than that, is to
Hmm.
really see that sort of push out. So, luxury high-end real estate, maybe not,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of pockets of innovation will occur. So, no, I'm actually bullish.
Hmm. No, I also think that personally, this will actually have a good impact on female labor force participation as well, because now it's been shown that flexibility can work. And
Absolutely.
one of the reasons why women have been leaving the workforce increasingly, when they have a child or when they get married, these are the 2 points at which, gender economists like myself will
Absolutely.
notice the, sort of
Absolutely.
drop off. Now companies cannot have the excuse to say, oh, you can't work from home. Well, we did it
And it worked
and it
for the
worked.
most part. For the most part.
Yeah, so I mean, but maybe also we'll see some kind of rotational shifts, etc., kind of cultures continue. So the other questions are related to specific sectors like textiles, commodities, and I mean housing we've already covered. So any last thoughts on these sectors and on B2G sectors, business
Look,
to government?
I'd love to talk about B2G because I think what you're going to see is a massive stimulus package around the world. And I think a lot of countries are going to be buying. And I think the Indian government also is, India doesn't have a national stockpile of anything, to
Hmm.
be honest, right? Literally the US came out and said, hey, our national stockpile of ventilators. And the number one was, we have a national stockpile of ventilators. Right? And so I think a lot of government organizations are going to have to ramp up. If you want and where are the opportunities in that, right? Look at what happened post SARS and post MERS in a lot of Asian countries that were affected, right? They had to have a massive procurement for public spaces, and that includes, a lot of protective gear, heat sensing devices, a whole bunch of electronics coming in, surveillance equipment, infrastructure, backend, all this stuff, down to, again, just basic polyester suits,
Hmm.
and having things right, because I think no government wants to, if this happens 3 to 5 years from now, or as it seems every 5 to 6 years, something like this seems to be coming out. No government wants to say we didn't learn anything from COVID-19,
Absolutely.
right? And people will want to know, are you prepared for the next one? And so I think there's going to be a massive B2G government support. I think good. One of the critical problems that India has had with B2G is payments and payments on time. I think the government has taken out good notices and circulars saying that please pay everybody on time. They have a great portal now tracking this. And I think, one, they will have to change the way they do procurement,
Hmm.
and especially for these sectors. And I'm really hoping that this COVID-19, they get rid of a lot of the stupid regulations. I love the GEMS marketplace. I really love it. It's one of the most innovative stuff they've done, right? But okay, I won't name the organization. We had one of the organizations in the CI circle who made it their mission that we're going to sign up as many people onto GEMS marketplace as we can, right? 6 months of effort later, they could get 5 people up on it. right? Because it was so difficult to get all the documentation, this stamp, that stamp, all that stuff, right? And so I'm really hoping that the government makes it a lot easier for government to procure. Really works on their payments. I think that is something that they should do and they will do if they want to do a stimulus of the economy. See, the biggest thing about the government is that, and this is a great market for them, right? Right. When people flee the stock market, you go to safe government debt, you go to bonds, you go to all of their stuff, right? So whether they pay today or they pay 3 months from now, that interest rate hardly matters to them at the moment. It gets difficult as it goes down in the future, because of course, then if they borrow too much, interest rate starts to pop up. But right now, governments are saying, this is what France is doing, right? Our cost of borrowing is zero. That's why we can delay tax for 6 months. We'll just assume we got it. And
Right.
and sort of we'll roll over those things. And so I think B2G, I really hope this unlocks a golden age of it. I think some states will do it a lot better than others, as always,
Yeah.
as always. But the intent is there, and I'm really hoping that it sort of pushes downstream on that.
Great. So, with that, we'll wrap this up. Firstly, I'd really like to thank you, Aditya. This has been a really invigorating discussion. You took all of the questions on the ball, and gave us some very interesting thoughts that we can take away with us. In the concluding points, I'd just like to remind everybody that we're going to be having another webinar tomorrow. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. with Prashant Sareen. He is a partner at Bain and Company, who will be talking about post-COVID world scenarios. And we are posting the registration link on the chat. And most importantly, if you want to know more about the Global Shapers New Delhi Hub or about YI Delhi, please feel free to write to us in this chat, or, just reach out to any of us who messaged you, and we'll be happy to give you more information. If you'd like to mail Aditya, can they mail you, email you maybe?
So what I'm going to try to do right now is I'm just going to try to paste my hold on, let me try to get this. So I'm just going to push my LinkedIn profile. Best way to get hold of me is
Great.
to just, mention that. I also would love if, plug, we are CI Delhi is also doing a webinar one tomorrow. I don't think it conflicts at all with this one, so you can join both. I posted that. We are going to talk to Bikram Bedi, the president of Gophers, on essential supply chains and how they're getting stuff to people. But we have about 12 to 13 ones, ranging from, on the 6th, a lot we covered, how to fire people compassionately and do it well. What's the legal part about it? How to, run your companies, how to manage cash flows. We have a very interesting thing with the CEO of JLL on real estate in India, getting his insights, getting some data into that. So I've pasted one URL, click on it. It has the list of all the webinars throughout the month. Love to get you guys all on that as well, please.
Thank you, Aditya, and thanks to everyone who stuck on. We still have 75, which means you kept them really interested and engaged.
No, I mean, I'm loving the questions, right? There's so many questions I wish would have gotten to, the entire university and internship market. But you know what? Do one thing. I am usually moderating the CI webinars. Join those, ask the questions again there, and I'll make sure somebody answers it from that perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye. Stay safe and stay paranoidly healthy, positively healthy.